My name's Dr. Paige Williams, and I'm a member of the team at the Centre for Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne. But prior to that, I worked at Geelong Grammar School for 11 years and was part of the small team that brought in positive psychology to the school. And through different roles that I held at the school, I then wrapped a PhD around my dedicated role as the Positive Institution Manager here. Which looked at how we create well-being in systems and how we create well-being specifically in schools outside of classrooms. One, because it helps us take a rigorous approach and means that we're, that classic building on the shoulders of giants and the research that's gone before. And secondly, it means that we can make a real contribution and understand what needs to come next. If they take an evidence-based approach and if they conduct their own research, it means they know what works and what doesn't, which means they can use resources more effectively, focus energy with more impact. So I think one thing that we learned early in the piece is that you don't have to label everything positive education for it to be positive education. So sometimes it's best to go underground, it's best to just do the work without calling everything positive education this, positive psychology that, because it can put some people off. And if we just get on and do the work and introduce the ideas and the skills and the mindsets and behaviours without necessarily explicitly labelling them, sometimes that can be a more effective way to work. Firstly, individual and community well-being are inherently tied. You can't really look at one without the other. And a criticism of positive psychology is that it's been too reductionist. And that's because it comes from a psychological science background, which is about stripping out the noise and trying to find what are the purest relationships we can find in a particular research situation. The reality is that life isn't like that. And so research that takes a more systemic approach to understanding well-being, and we have a research centre at the University of Melbourne that is systems-informed positive psychology, specifically for that purpose, for us to actually build back in some of the noise of real life and actually look at how is it we can take a systems approach, a systemic approach to thinking and understanding well-being and researching well-being, knowing that in doing that we will get perhaps a less clear picture, but one that more closely matches reality and understand more about how to move well-being for people in real-life situations. For me personally, in my experience at Geelong Grammar, I'd been working at the school for about 6 or 7 years by the time we started really to embed positive education in classroom practice. And it became pretty clear to me that actually what we needed to do was take an evidence-based approach and take an evidence-based approach that looked at the whole system. We had a number of visiting scholars at the school, and one of them was James Powalski, who's a very high-standing academic in positive psychology in the US. And James and his wife stayed at the school for a period of time. And he tells the story of how he overheard students commenting on the sunset one evening. And they were saying how lovely it was, and then followed up that comment with, "Oh, look, that's my strength of appreciation of beauty and excellence." And for James to come back and tell us the story in the positive education department, and for us to realise quite how things were shifting so much in terms of the language that was being used and the fact that something like the VIA character strengths was becoming part of normal conversation between students, that's when you realise that things are changing at quite a deep level. Yeah. Positive education research is still in its infancy. The field as a whole is only nearly 20 years old. Positive education, if we suggest that Geelong Grammar was really the start of that journey, is nearly 10 years old. So to say, what's the future? Well, the future is everything we haven't looked at yet, which is so much. it's wonderful that we're beginning to get an understanding of the kinds of curriculum topics and structures and practice, classroom practice, that starts to shift young people's well-being. But we don't have longitudinal data on that. We don't know what works for what students, under what circumstances. We haven't really researched extensively different types of schools in different socio-economic groups with different cultural backgrounds. So when you look at it internationally, we've done about 0.01% of the research that we could do in positive education. So I think the future is busy. I think there's lots of opportunity. And I think the challenge will be, how can we be strategic about choosing those research areas that will make the most difference and that can really inform education policy moving forward in a meaningful and impactful way. I think there's real opportunity for us to get a greater understanding of what an implicit positive education curriculum could look like. So how is it that actually, if we take the national curriculum in any particular state and look at how we can embed the principles, the processes into teaching geography, history, English in a normal curriculum sense, so that whilst there may be opportunity to have explicit positive education classes, even if there isn't, it doesn't mean that there isn't something that's helping students gain well-being skills in their normal classroom experience. So it's a term I call positive pedagogy, and I think that that's a huge opportunity for positive education in the future. I think as we start to access more technologically advanced approaches to measuring well-being, that they can be then embedded in a classroom context. So for example, my colleague at the University of Melbourne, Diane Valla-Broderick, she has a number of objective measures, physiological measures of well-being. Now, if the technology advances so much that actually we can start monitoring and measuring that as students have a real-time classroom experience, that's really going to move things forward in terms of our understanding of ebb and flow, of engagement, of flow, of positive and negative emotion, what's going on in a classroom. And you tie that with something like positive pedagogy, and we've got something very powerful in terms of understanding the well-being based experience of students at school. So I think there's some very exciting technology advances that will really give us a platform to move from with positive education research.